Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us at the 19th Annual Acquisition Research Symposium, hosted by the Acquisition Research Program at the Naval Postgraduate School. My name is Jim Newman, Chair and Professor of the Space Systems Academic Group at NPS, and I'll be chairing this panel. Any views I express today are my own personal views and should not be construed as anything else. I'm joined by panelists in the order of their presentations. Claire Buck, U.S. Government Accountability Office. Mike Orosz, University of Southern California. Erin Cohen, she's at the U.S. Government Accountability Office also. And then Chad Millette, U.S. Space Force, Space Systems Command. I will start our conversation today with a brief note that federal acquisitions have always perplexed me. In my career as an instructor and as an astronaut at NASA many years ago now, I ended up being involved in a few procurements, and I became aware of some of the strong points and some of the weak points of federal acquisitions. My more recent experience at the Naval Postgraduate School reinforced that. And I have always wondered, why do we do it to ourselves, and isn't there a better way? Now, as NPS Professor Clay Moltz discusses in his 2019 article on 21st Century Space Power, published in the Air University Strategic Studies Quarterly, is the rapid transfer of technology from the private sector to the military sector, the creation of other transactional authorities, OTAs, creation of the Space Development Agency in 2019, and the creation of the DIU, the Defense Innovation, that has resulted in a sea change in space acquisitions. Commercial space power now rivals military space power, a shift from top-down government-led innovation to bottom-up commercial sector-led innovation, and the building of resilient architectures by commercial space companies, combined with the help of our allies, has transformed the space acquisition arena. Today, we bring together various perspectives on these and other questions related to the title of our panel. Can space acquisition chart new agile processes? Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to pose questions to the panelists. We will answer questions after everyone has presented. Claire, thank you for going first today. Over to you.
Thanks, Jim. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Did that work?
Looks good.
All right. Thank you to the symposium for having me today and letting me present. My name is Claire Buck, and I'm a senior analyst with the U.S. Government Accountability Office in Denver. I'm part of the Contracting and National Security Acquisitions team, and I've been here for more than 18 years, researching, reporting, and making recommendations on topics like national security space launch, overhead persistent infrared system like today's program, space command and control, and all topics related to satellites. Today, I'll be answering the question that's on all your minds, which is, can the next generation OPIR program overcome an aggressive schedule using the middle tier of acquisition? I plan to introduce the work that led to this presentation and give you guys a little background on OPIR systems. I'll go over how the Space Force structured the next generation OPIR acquisition strategy to try to mitigate the risks associated with its aggressive launch schedule. I'll explain GAO's assessment of the program and the question at hand. And then at the end, I'll identify some of the more significant challenges remaining in the program and GAO's recommendations to the DoD and US Space Force as the program continues. GAO issued 2 reports on next-gen OPIR last year. One contained controlled unclassified information, and that effort was led by none other than my fellow panel member today and good friend, Erin Cohen. The second report, which was public, forms the basis of today's presentation. In that report, we identified the challenges facing the next-gen OPIR program and the extent to which the Space Force is addressing those challenges. and we assessed whether and if the next-gen OPIR program would address the capabilities provided by the current missile warning program. To answer these questions, we reviewed acquisition strategies, risk assessment and mitigation plans, departmental guidance, and cost and schedule estimates. We also interviewed officials from the offices of the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, the Secretary of the Air Force, Space and Missile Systems Center, which is now known as the Space Systems Command, and the various prime and subcontractors involved in next-gen OPIR development efforts. For more than 50 years, the U.S. defense and intelligence communities have relied on OPIR systems to provide essential launch detection, missile warning and tracking, and reconnaissance data to predict and respond to a variety of threats, both environmental and man-made. The Defense Support Program, known as DSP, started in the 1970s and launched more than 20 OPIR satellites to the geosynchronous Earth orbit. Many of the DSP satellites lived well beyond their expected design lives, and in fact, some are still providing useful data today. To follow up, the DSP program, started in 1996, was called the Space-Based Infrared System, or SBIRS. And I know Chad on our panel, who worked on the SBIRS program years ago, will agree with me that while the SBIRS constellation is working beautifully today and has been for years, the SBIRS program started out on rocky ground. In fact, the program experienced such significant development delays that it required several rebaselining efforts to bring the cost and schedule baselines back on track. A lot of things went wrong in the early days of the SBIRS acquisition, and we reported on the mismanagement by the Air Force, immature technologies and unclear requirements, unstable funding, and a general underestimation by the Air Force of the complexity of the software and ground system. Ultimately, the SBIRS total cost grew by about 260%, from $5.6 billion in 1996 to $20.3 billion in 2011. But all was forgiven in 2011 when the first SBIRS GEO satellite launched and began providing some of the best OPIR data we'd ever seen. I know Chad was watching that launch, like many of my GAO colleagues and I were, praying for a successful mission, and SBIRS hasn't disappointed us yet. But now the SBIRS design is several decades old, and it's time to plan for the next generation of OPIR satellites. And so we have the next generation OPIR program. The Space Force plans for the first block of the program, called Block 0, to consist of 5 satellites, 3 satellites in the GEO orbit and 2 polar orbiting satellites. It's also planning a new ground system that will consist of mission data processing capabilities to that will analyze and disseminate data to users, command and control capabilities that will operate the satellites, and relay ground stations for communicating with the satellites. The Space Force plans to launch all 5 satellites by 2030, but the real pressure comes from the launch requirement for the first GEO satellite. In 2017, the Joint Requirements and Oversight Council, the JROC, validated requirements for the next-gen OPIR program, including a provision that the first GEO satellite was to launch no later than 2025. Now remember that the last OPIR program, SBIRS, started in 1996 and launched its first GEO satellite in 2011. That's 15 years. And next-gen OPIR is required to design, develop, and build an enhanced GEO satellite in about 7 years. No pressure, right? So the Space Force knew it had no time to lose and decided early on to designate the next-gen OPIR program a middle-tier acquisition program, an MTA. This was in 2018, so the MTA pathway was very new at that time. In fact, the next-gen OPIR program was one of the first MTA efforts, predating much of the guidance that's available to programs today. Space Force designated the program a rapid prototyping effort, which means the program has to produce an operational prototype within 5 years. In this case, the prototype will be the main mission payload, or infrared sensor, for the first next-gen OPIR GEO satellite. The Space Force's MTA designation allowed the next-gen OPIR program to bypass the traditional DoD 5000 series of acquisition directives and the milestone-based acquisition approach. In practical terms, It allowed the program to initiate faster and without some of the red tape usually associated with program initiation. It also provided the program with some leeway in awarding initial contracts to get the development ball rolling. The program awarded prime contracts shortly after initiation, and development on NextGen OPIR began in earnest in 2018. Given the program's highly aggressive schedule, the Space Force did some other pretty innovative things in its acquisition strategy. To address the technical risk in developing a new main mission payload and to ensure the new sensor would be ready for integration at the end of the 5-year MTA window, the Space Force decided to fully fund 2 competing payload developers to design and build the first payload, with the promise that the best of the 2 designs would fly on 2 of the 3 geosatellites in Block 0. And provided that the runner-up payload design was functional and could meet mission requirements, the runner-up would fly on the 2nd geosatellite. This guarantee provided an incentive to the payload developers to keep their best and brightest on the job and to deliver within the required timeframe. A similar payload competition will be held for the polar mission and will leverage the most appropriate geo payload design. The subcontractors competing to design and build the geo payload are the same ones who will compete for the polar payload. To minimize the level of new development, the Space Force chose prime contractors at the outset that already had proven spacecraft designs for the needed orbits, Lockheed Martin for GEO and Northrop Grumman for Polar. The Space Force awarded sole source contracts in 2018. And finally, to help ensure that DoD can use the GEO satellites once they're launched, the program is developing an interim ground system capability in case the planned ground system delivery is late. This is actually a lesson learned from the SBIRS program, which launched its first satellite before the ground system could fully utilize the data coming down. The first satellite was actually on orbit for several years before the data it provided could be fully exploited. So, our assessment and the answer to our question of the day, Space Force's early steps provided some schedule relief. They were able to expedite program start, accelerate their prime contract awards, and get development underway significantly faster because of the MTA designation. The multiple ways in which they tried to minimize new development in the design of the program was a good strategy, and the end-to-end competition between payload developers likely yielded results. In fact, and this isn't in the slides because it hadn't happened at the time of our report, both payload developers have now successfully completed critical design reviews for their payloads, which marks a significant achievement for the program. But ultimately, developing new technologies is hard and it takes time. And what do they always say? You can't schedule innovation. And saving time at the beginning of the program can't alleviate the risks associated with developing and integrating new technologies. So our assessment was and is that significant technical and managerial challenges remain. Some of the remaining challenges are listed here. Even though the critical design reviews are complete, there's still quite a bit of integration that needs to take place and testing on the payloads before one can be considered operational and be delivered for integration with the spacecraft. Second, despite the initial planning by the program to use proven spacecraft designs, the mission requirements for NextGen OPIR necessitated some vehicle modifications, potentially calling into question vehicle design and/or production reliability, not to mention the first-time integration that's going to take place between the brand new payload design and newly modified spacecraft. Next, getting the ground system functional, interim or otherwise, is a complicated task. And we know from SBIRS and other satellite programs that the Space Force tends to underestimate the complexity of software for ground systems. Another watch item for us, the Space Force is taking on the role of lead integrator for the first time in this mission area. A lead system integrator is responsible for ensuring that the space and ground segments of a program work together. In the case of NextGen OPIR, this requires working with multiple prime and subcontractors to develop components like sensors, software, and electronics across both the space and ground segments. Ultimately, the Space Force itself is going to have to ensure that the many integrated components of NextGen OPIR combine to form a whole and functioning system that delivers the program's enhanced missile warning capability. Finally, the leadership environment is in flux and has been for some time. With the stand-up of the Space Force in 2019, the reorganization of the Space and Missile Systems Center, Space Systems Command, and the establishment of the Space Development Agency in 2019, which is also now transitioning to the Space Force, the landscape seems to be constantly changing. And in that churn, it's hard to see how some roles and responsibilities can maintain clarity. To that end, and also speaking to the remaining risks in the Next Gen OPIR program, we made 2 recommendations in our report. In 2020, the Senate Appropriations Committee designated the Next Gen OPIR program as a special interest item and required the program to provide quarterly updates. In reviewing those updates, we assessed that the information the Space Force provided lacked transparency in cost and schedule risks that the program continues to face. In other words, we thought the reports were overly optimistic. We therefore recommended that the Space Force include more realistic information in their reports to Congress. And truly, this is in the program's best interest, because we all know that better, more realistic estimates lead to better program outcomes. And ultimately, we all want this program to succeed. Our second recommendation was to the DoD, and we recommended that the Secretary of Defense should formalize a plan to coordinate the various efforts across multiple agencies and to ensure that future OPIR capabilities are going to meet warfighter needs. DoD partially agreed with both of our recs, and we've already seen an improvement in the risk data provided to Congress in their quarterly reports on the program. You know, we all recognize that what these guys are doing is hard and it's amazing and it's critical to national security, and all we want to do is help. And in the spirit of helping, I'll be happy to take any questions, although I think we're doing questions at the end. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Mike.
Hello.
Stop sharing.
There it is. All right. Okay, well, good afternoon. And I'm Mike Orosz from USC's Information Sciences Institute. We're located in Marina Del Rey, not too far from the what was the Space Missiles Center, but now is the Space Systems Command. And today we're going to talk about a project that's been ongoing since really roughly 2016, introducing Agile and DevSecOps into the space acquisition environment. It's an effort with a number of my colleagues who are not here. They're actually working a milestone B issue. Lieutenant Colonel Grant Spear with the Air Force, and Brian Duffy and Craig Charlton, who are systems engineers. We're funded originally with the Air Force money, but then in the last year or so, it was Space Force money through CERC, the Systems Engineering Research Center. And in addition, we did some collaboration with Georgia Tech Institute, Research Institute. So what are we doing? We're trying to improve the software-based acquisition process in the space domain. And primarily, that means, can we figure out methods, lessons learned, recommendations, guidelines that can take us from a traditional, 5,000 waterfall approach into this Agile DevSecOps process, so that we can remain more competitive, become more competitive, and stay on top of things compared to what our competitors are doing. And part of that process is also, integrating new techniques, new technologies, new approaches that are being developed in the research community into the acquisition program. And very importantly, working on educating our current and future workforce. So the process, to really understand the acquisition process, and even though we've been doing this now since 2016, we're still learning about the DoD acquisition environment. And the way that we do this is we are actually immersed in the environment. We are part of the government's team. So we're actively engaged in all the scrums and ceremonies. We also provide subject matter expertise on systems engineering. Many of our team are former members of the Air Force who were part of the acquisition environment, and particularly with space vehicles and the ground segment, which is what we're focusing on here, is the ground segment. And so we're in it every day. So we're part of the workforce. And at the same time, we're collecting, data, what's working, what's not working, making suggestions both to the government team as well as to the contractor as to ways to improve the Agile and DevSecOps environment to improve the process, and with the ultimate goal of improving training, improving recommendations, and really pulling this together into a lessons learned recommendation for not just the Space Force, but all of the DoD acquisition environment. As I think everyone online here knows, there's quite a bit of similarities between the different services, et cetera. So what we're learning, we feel could be beneficial to others. So that's our main goal and process. So there are, in this program, and again, it started roughly in 2016, late 2016, and it's gone through a series of evolutions. There are 3 projects that we've been involved with. The first one, we call it Project A, and it's traditional waterfall, roughly 39 months in duration, a mid-sized program, about 180,000 lines of software. It's been completed, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And that serves as our baseline. It's pure traditional waterfall. Then we have Project B, which is a hybrid. Roughly half of the project was using traditional waterfall methods, and the other half using Agile and DevSecOps processes. A little shorter in duration, about 25 months, and a little smaller in size. But very importantly, it's same complexity of software. It's all ground station focused. Very little difference between no difference actually between the mission environment that they're targeting. Then that's completed, and now between Project B and Project C, which I'll talk about in a minute, there was a study that was undertaken, funded by the Space Force, to help do trade studies on technical challenges that would be part of Project C, as well as to help both the contractor and the government ramp up to an Agile and DevSecOps environment. The goal here is Project C is going to be predominantly Agile and DevSecOps. And so while the RFP was being written and funding was being acquired, let's do a study. That lasted about 15 months. Of course, there's no software lines of code, but we did end up with a very robust project backlog and an Agile environment, as well as a fairly trained workforce on both the contractor and the government side for preparing for Project C. And that brings us to Project C. Again, ground station focus, same type of mission space, same complexity of software. We're 1 year into a 52-month project. And it is dominantly Agile and DevSecOps, although there's definitely some waterfall components, as we'll talk about shortly. So again, 3 major projects over the last almost 6 years. And in addition, Project C, because of the size, even though we don't have an estimated software lines of code yet, it's a safe, it's scaled Agile. We're using a nuanced version of SAFe. We don't have epics, but we have program increments and features and short and stories, et cetera. Again, to implement a fairly large effort using Agile and DevSecOps. So a little bit about Project A and B, which again have been completed, and this has previously been reported, but just wanted to bring it to everyone's attention just to get a grounding of where we're at. Project A again was all waterfall, and Project B was half waterfall, half Agile. And comparing apples to apples, the hybrid project produced roughly 85.5% less problem reports, bugs, if you will, than Project A, which again is the waterfall effort. Quite a remarkable finding. Again, it's just one data point, but it clearly shows that there's definitely advantages to looking at Agile and bringing it into the acquisition world. If you look at the chart to the right, the upper trace, sort of olive drab in color, you'll notice 2 peaks. Those are 2 bow wave peaks during integration and testing that were produced during the waterfall effort, Project A. And what happened is there were so many PRs produced during integration and testing. We actually had to stop the process, fix the discovered PRs, and then start up the INT process again. It's happened in other projects. This is not new, but it's just an example of some of the challenges you find in waterfall. The lower gold or yellow trace, that's the hybrid trace of the PRs. And as you can see, there's definitely a bump, a bow wave, but that's is almost totally attributed to the waterfall side of the house, not the Agile, which we'll see here in the next click. If you just look at project B by itself, the waterfall portion of it versus the Agile portion produced even better results, 95.7% less open problem reports over the course of the project. And not only that, but the Agile team started 10 months later than the waterfall team. And the Agile team was composed of very new recruits right out of college, didn't know much about DoD acquisition, knew a little bit about waterfall, didn't know a whole lot about Agile. And so there was a learning curve, and yet they still greatly outperformed, at least in terms of PRs, during the project. And so again, a couple of data points, doesn't tell the whole story, but the vector at least is pointing in the right direction. So now we go to the study and the first year of project C. And really, we're just starting the coding, the heavy duty coding in the project. So more to come in a future date. But here are some observations. Okay. One, not a surprise, I'm sure, to most here online, that the rigidity of the basically the requirements document, which we call the capabilities development document, CDD, hampers Agile development. Again, you can be Agile and you can make changes in terms of when requirements actually get completed, but it does require a lot of overhead, going up the chain of command and making appropriate requests for adjustments, particularly when you have a new requirement coming on board, through a request for a change process. It just, if we can streamline that, that would be very helpful. And again, more to offer on that later in another talk. Implementing Agile still requires good upfront engineering. You can't just take a quick look at the requirements, decompose them quickly into features and put them on a project backlog and assign some priorities to it and then go. Not with a complex software system that has many moving parts that's part of a larger enterprise. You do need to do a thorough job of decomposing those requirements into features, and also, very importantly, understanding the dependencies, both within the system you're developing, but very importantly, outside of your system. Again, this is an enterprise you're working in, and you need to understand that, because when you're making adjustments to the project backlog during development, you need to understand, if you're moving features into a future program increment, what dependencies are impacted. And so there's still a lot of upfront work that needs to be done. Due to licensing issues and import restrictions, these are classified projects. There are actually a lack of suitable performance measuring tools. A lot of them, there's a lot of tools out there in the market, but we can't use them on the project because of the classified nature of the project. So we've ended up having to modify existing tools and/or developing new tools to help with performance tracking. And so it's something not to forget as you're merging into or evolving into an Agile environment. Again, no surprise to most people, there's no one size fits all. Again, our goal is to come up with guidelines, because every program is a little different. There's little nuances. Program increments are often too short. This is particularly true at the beginning of the program. Program increment, again, is where you have your sprint cycles embedded and you're working off features. And because of all the ceremonies and the intercomplexities of having multiple teams communicating with each other, sometimes a 2-week sprint is not enough. You need a 3-week sprint. So just a heads up, you may have to experiment with that a bit as you're starting to develop the program to find the right cadence. This has happened in every single case that we've worked with. Another lesson: allocate stories up front to the sprints. If you wait as you start to work each sprint and then allocate stories, almost always you'll never complete all the stories by the end of the program increment. And that creates then a bow wave of work going into the next increment. And then you got yourself in a big challenge. You really need to do that up front. What needs to be worked first, second, and third to allow time to work the hard problems. And also a lot of teams, even after a year of working in the process, they still allocate too many story points, too much work up front to a PI. What you want, and there's a kind of rule of thumb that we've discovered, is roughly 80% of your capacity, the amount of work your team can do, should be allocated to allow that 20% to deal with, incoming hot items, like an RFC that's come along, or to deal with some harder than you forecasted stories that need to be completed. You need a little bit of slack in there. Otherwise, you do run the risk of running over into the next program increment. Again, probably not a surprise, but this happens all the time. Stay focused on MVPs and MMPs. A lot of the teams want to do the low-hanging fruit first, but that just pushes the work down the road. And in training. Onboarding, you need to train new people, and then you have to continue to train because the technology is changing, approaches are changing, and so figure training to be a big part of the process. And finally, really important, you need a near operations like test environment as soon as possible. Lots of these ground station systems are developed in parallel to the space vehicle, and you don't have access to the real world. So you need, in order for that continuous integration and deployment, you need a near ops as quickly as possible. And finally, wrapping up, again, we're about 12 months in. We'll continue to be working with the government team, looking at ways to improve the process. And one of those challenge areas is synchronizing the actual PI planning with the integrated master schedule, which drives EVM metrics. Big challenge area that we're right in the middle of trying to get through. And again, finally, I'll continue developing and refining training materials and processes. So with that, I'm going to end, and I look forward to questions, and I'll turn it over to Erin.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen. Just take me a second. Okay. So today I'm going to be talking to you about a report that we did last year on the Mobile User Objective Systems. It's a satellite program, and it does narrowband satellite communications. I have been with the GAO for about 14 years, and for 10 of those years, I have worked with Claire on military space acquisitions. Most recently, I've gotten into NASA acquisitions, so that's been a new adventure for me. When we started our work on MUOS, we were asked by the Senate Armed Services Committee to look at the program, and the reason being DoD has invested quite a lot of money to build, develop, and begin launching and delivering MUOS, but as we've reported from starting in about 2007, longstanding gaps between when they fielded the satellites and the user terminals have really limited DoD's ability to use the system. We did do a CUI version of the report first, which was issued in June 2021, and then we followed up with the public report, which is linked in the first slide of my presentation. So for those of you who aren't familiar, a little background on MUOS. So as you probably know, DoD uses military satellite communications to support its operations across air, land, sea, and space. And MUOS is DoD's most recent ultra high, so UHF, frequency narrowband military system. There are 3 types of military SATCOM: protected, wideband, and narrowband, which is the focus of our report today. And basically, the reason why narrowband is important is because it has some benefits to soldiers in the field. Narrowband is less vulnerable to weather conditions and other physical limitations like dense foliage and challenging terrain. DoD gets its UHF, its narrowband, from 3 different satellite systems currently: FleetSat, the UHF follow-on satellites, and then MUOS. And just to clarify, MUOS actually has 2 pieces of hardware on board, and this is important. The first set of hardware is what's called legacy UHF, and that's in use today. And then it has a piece of hardware that's advanced, the advanced capability, and that's what we are referring to now when we talk about MUOS. So our report found that DoD is not using the full capabilities of MUOS. The constellation, which includes 4 satellites and a spare, has been on orbit for now actually over 5 years. But DoD is not using the advanced communications capacity. Why? Basically because DoD ran into some issues with synchronizing the delivery of all of the elements that you need to use a satellite system: the satellites themselves, the ground system, and the user terminals. And then this is a little picture here of soldiers in the field using a MUOS terminal. The terminals that leverage the legacy payload or the legacy UHF are widespread across DoD. Some of the issues that DoD faced with its satellites were basically technical challenges that slowed the development and launch of the satellites. And then it also ran into issues with the actual terminals. So the Army was developing the user terminals, and they faced a lot of challenges with reliability, heat issues in testing, which basically made them restructure the whole program in 2012. So currently, DoD, like I said, uses the legacy capability extensively, but the legacy capability on the MUOS satellites only accounts for about 10% of the whole constellation. And so they're basically not using 90% of what's on air. I guess the good news is that recently in 2020 and 2021, DoD began using the advanced capability in 1 or 2 military operations. So just a little bit. Sorry, my dogs are barking. It just happens. I wanted to talk over, just to kind of illustrate basically the plan that DoD had for how it was going to field terminals and then use MUOS versus the reality. So on the left side of the dotted line is the plan versus the reality. So you can see in 2019, they only had 10% of terminals fielded that they needed to actually use MUOS's advanced capability. Additionally, DoD faced some pretty big challenges to using MUOS. They faced some challenges to fielding terminals, which included a lack of terminal funding. Additionally, their terminal acquisition management was fragmented across different offices within the services. And integrating terminals onto weapons platforms is actually very complex, as you would imagine, and it varies. So a portable terminal that's to be used in the field, that's very easy to integrate and just start using. One that needs to be installed on a ship or aircraft is much more complicated and much more expensive. Additionally, so I kind of alluded to this already, but so currently users of military narrowband satellite communications who use the legacy UHF system, those systems are oversubscribed. So there may be issues with actually getting communication there. And these networks will continue to be oversubscribed while DoD tries to field the terminals and transition the networks for users to actually use that 90% of the MUOS capability. At the same time, the MUOS satellites are getting older. They're, as all satellites do. They've been on orbit for 5 years now, and DoD recently requested dollars to acquire 2 additional satellites. However, the additional satellites for MUOS will not have the legacy UHF capability. So the oversubscription issue is not likely to go away anytime soon. At the time of our review, additionally, DoD had not explored or adopted any narrowband communication options that would help meet some of these unmet near-term communication needs. In 2019, the Army recommended that DoD consider putting the legacy payload on the new MUOS satellites, or putting a legacy payload on any satellite, and the SecDef chose not to. During the time of our review, they also we learned that they were exploring some other options, a connectivity gateway, but these options were not meant to be used widespread across the services. They were really for more like specialized users. So that's an ongoing issue. And then at the same time, you know, because MUOS is on orbit, it's getting older, we need to start thinking about what's next. To do that, DoD needs to do an AOA, an analysis of alternatives. Our report found that offices within DoD, the services, the Navy, have been ringing that bell for 7 years, saying we need to start an AOA to figure out what we're going to do after MUOS. However, DoD has not updated what its requirements are for narrowband, and the uses of narrowband have really changed. So over the last decade or so, since the last time they updated their requirements in 2010, the SATCOM needs for users have increased. So we're talking, folks in the field and at bases want to send pictures. They want real-time updates. They just have greater data needs. Technology has advanced. So at the time that MUOS was developed, it used cellular technology known as 3G. And at the time that was cutting edge. Well, I think, we all probably have those cell phones now that say 5G. And so technology has advanced, and MUOS is now facing obsolescence issues. And then over the last decade plus, space has changed. It has become a contested operational environment, and our adversaries are actively developing systems to block our communication capabilities. So because of this, we made 2 recommendations. We recommended that DoD explore and implement an additional option for providing narrowband SATCOM capabilities in the near term, while it explores what it wants to do next for MUOS. And then we also recommended that it update its narrowband satellite communication requirements so that it is prepared to do an AOA beginning as early as this year. We provided a copy of our report to DoD, as we always do, and in their comments, they concurred with our recommendations and reiterated their agreement with our recommendation to explore additional options. So with that, I am happy to take questions when we're all done, and I will hand it off to Chad.
Thank you so much, Erin. Appreciate that. And I appreciate the opportunity to present to you all this afternoon, as they used to say on Monty Python, now for something completely different, right? So I am the Chief Learning Officer for Space Systems Command. And what I want to talk to you about today is our development, our effort as we proceeded to identify acquisition occupational competencies for the Space Force. The question that I set out to answer with regards to this paper and this presentation is, how do you determine what the right occupational competencies are for a space acquisition workforce? How would a new service, one that's barely 2+ years old, identify and select these competencies? And should you start from scratch, or if not, should you leverage models? And if so, which ones? Let me get into some background on what we're talking about here. Not too long ago, the Space Force released a product called the Guardian Ideal. The Guardian Ideal lays out radical talent management methodologies for the Space Force, not standard military, as you might be familiar with, DP or manpower and personnel type activities, but full-on talent management and some pretty radical ways of doing it, methodologies that are informed by academia and informed by industry. One of the tenets of this radical transformation is moving to a fully competency-based framework. The idea here is that every Space Force position will be coded by the proficiencies for that position and, the competencies for that position and the requisite proficiencies. And when we get to operationalize this, the idea would be that Guardians can look in the database for positions that they're interested in and find out what competencies and proficiencies are required for that. And then they can look at their record. And if they notice that there's a gap, that's where I, as the Chief Learning Officer, would come in, right? And that's where I would come in and provide them with the learning and development opportunities to close the gap in proficiency between where they are and where they'd like to be. What do we mean by competencies? In the Guardian Ideal, they specifically identify and define competencies: knowledge, skills, abilities, experiences, and characteristics that manifest in behaviors. Here's another way of looking at that, and I'm stealing this from my Air Education and Training Command brothers and sisters. I think this is a really solid way of depicting competencies as they result, as those knowledge, skills, abilities, experiences, and other characteristics result in what we see. The behaviors are what we see. And so how can we, as a Space Force in the acquisition community, how can we define the set of competencies that will result in the behaviors that we hope to have? If you were a quick reader of the little blurb that came out of the Guardian Ideal, you might have noticed that there are two different types of competencies. There are foundational competencies and occupational competencies. The idea is foundational competencies are those that every Guardian should possess some level of proficiency in. Those competencies are the purview of our Space Training and Readiness Command, and providing those fundamental levels, increases in proficiency on those foundational competencies. What we're talking about here are the occupational competencies. Now, within the Space Force, there are 5 active duty occupations: space operations, cyberspace, intelligence, acquisition management, and developmental engineers. When I'm talking about the acquisition occupational competencies, I'm talking about the acquisition manager and the developmental engineer competencies. AETC, our friends at Air Education and Training Command, have a tried and true methodology that involves a 2-phase strategy. The first stage is planning, and the second stage is building and validating the model. We began the planning for this effort in August of last year, and what that involved was getting subject matter experts in this field, in acquisitions, as well as in competency development, and having some initial discussions so that we could identify what is the scope of this effort, what are the objectives, and what are the timelines so that we can get to the ultimate result, which is a functional and validated model. The mechanism by which we started that process in execution was phase 2 was the study that we held in January of 22. Earlier this year, we met at Los Angeles Air Force Base, and over the course of a week, we engaged in the study activity, and then following up with what is still kind of ongoing is the validation activity. In the planning, when we start talking about what are our requirements, what is our scope, what's in, what's out, one of the nuances, you may have noticed when I described the active duty career fields in the Space Force, I didn't say anything about active duty financial managers or active duty contracting professionals. So the way the Space Force program offices at Space Systems Command are constructed, there are Department of the Air Force acquisition civilians. There is no such thing as a Space Force civilian. All of us that work supporting the Space Force are Department of the Air Force civilians. As I mentioned, our contracting and finance active duty support actually comes from airmen, from the Air Force. And then we have our program managers and our developmental engineers that are active duty guardians. And so the question is, what are these, who do these competencies cover? Who do they represent? And this is a significant scoping activity. Because of the nature of the active duty guardians, the decision was made that that was the group that we would target with coming up with these first set of competencies. And so what we, and their civilian counterparts. So we are talking about acquisition management or program managers, and engineering and technology management, or the actual career field inside the Space Force is developmental engineers. The study itself. So once we had identified what the scope was, then it was how do we build the team and execute the actual study to come up with a model for competencies. So our AETC friends participated. We had some good participation from SAF AQ, our acquisition career manager. So the person that oversees the acquisition managers and developmental engineer workforce. And then there's a specific position in there for space workforce integration, and she was able to participate. As the predominance of that workforce is represented in Space Systems Command, formerly Space and Missile Systems Center, we wanted to participate as well. So I participated in the study, as well as our career field team leads. We have an engineering team lead, and we have program management. And finally, we wanted to include, when we looked at the demographics of the people I've mentioned thus far, they skewed to the salt and pepper, as you might see in my beard, more salt than pepper lately. But we needed to get some other perspectives. We wanted to increase at least the age and experience diversity of the team. And so the Space Force has a developmental program called the Galaxy program that where participants are competitively selected. And so what we did by including acquisition managers and developmental engineers from the Galaxy program was we found relatively high performing junior officers who could represent their perspective in the competencies that we would need today and in the future. Inside the study, team identified, team formed, we got together inside the study. The first thing we did was a future scan discussion where we talked about what did we see the future of our workforce looking like in these two fields. Then we were given an activity to identify the top competencies from various sources. Our pre-study material included the Office of Personnel Management Mosaic competencies, which are kind of a generic set of competencies. We had several types of program or project management competencies that we were given to look at beforehand, as well as a couple of different ones for the engineering workforce, including one that was based on an NPS paper from a few years ago. What we did when we were tasked in the study, we decided to narrow it down such that we had an activity where each individual person in the study was to identify their top competencies And we pulled them from, on the PM side, from the OSD PM competencies, and then on the engineering side from the OSD competency model. So we felt those were legitimate, justifiable sources with which to begin the activity. Each individual identified their top 10 competencies, and then the AETC facilitator then led us through a clustering and categorizing activity where we recognized some of them were essentially saying the same thing, or one was a subcompetency of another. And so we were able to do some massaging of the input. And at the end of that stage, we had a draft list for both areas, for both program management and engineering. We had draft competency lists. Then we moved into identifying what are the behaviors for each level of proficiency. And as you see on the right, our competency models have 4 levels: basic, intermediate, advanced, and expert. And so what we were then tasked to do was draft common behaviors of basic level proficiency within each of the competencies. And so we started doing, and then following that, the task was to then map soft skills, which were derived from the foundational competencies, which had already been further along in identification for the Space Force. It was mapping which of those soft skills foundational competencies most applied to the competencies for program management and for engineering. This turned out to be more daunting than was able to be accomplished. And our AETC facilitator noted that this was the first time they had tried to do 2 different career fields in the same week. What we had done is we had bitten off more than we could chew. And so by the end of the week-long study, we had the behaviors for each level of proficiency for program management, but we had not done the soft skills mapping, and we hadn't even done the behaviors for the draft competency list for engineers. Those activities were accomplished after the fact. They were done virtually after the in-person study was completed. I can't share with you the results because we haven't published them yet. The Space Force has not released the competencies. I will tell you that that's around the corner by the end of this month, maybe certainly by the end of June. On the PM side, we came up with 11. So there are competency categories. You may see, 3 competency categories, and then we identified 11 sub-competencies. But I'm really not at liberty, to share those yet. Besides once we had the model, the next step in the second phase is to validate that model. And the way that AETC's methodology exists to do the validation is to survey the workforce. 2 different surveys go out. One goes to the workforce writ large, and one goes to the leadership. The respondents are asked to rate the importance of those competencies in doing their job, and then to map those competencies to typical job description, job titles throughout the Space Force. At the time that I put the paper together, in the time of building the presentation, the response rates, there was a challenge with getting response rates that made the results statistically significant with which to move out on. That is, since as time has progressed, that's why the Space Force is almost on deck, is almost ready to release these competencies to the masses, is because they were able to get the response rates to something that is palatable, and there have been final reports that have been presented and the models have been finalized. But again, I'm not allowed to share those. I'm not getting ahead of Space Force leadership on that one. Some analysis of the activity, okay? We are going to have PM and EN occupational competencies, but the question still remains. Our program offices are full of other functional areas. Under the Back to Basics effort, right, there's 2 different types of finance. There's logistics, there's test and evaluation, and there's contracting. What about those workforces? And so the Space Force S1 organizations have decided that we're going to tackle those later. And so there are subsequent activities that we're going to grab those. Our competencies that we identified are subsets of previously identified OSD ones. Is that okay? Does that mean they're the right ones? What would it have been like if we'd have started with a clean sheet of paper? Would we come up with a different set? Would they have been better? We're going to baseline this set and move out, and we'll find out. So finally, our plan within the Space Force to move to fully competency-based talent management requires that we identify the occupational competencies for every single position within the Space Force. And we're moving out on that, which is a bit of a radical departure from our heritage within the Air Force. In order to do this correctly, we need the right set of occupational competencies. And we followed a solid methodology to identify this first iteration. And that's what these are. These will end up being the first iteration. And we will learn through coding the positions and measuring proficiency and doing assignments and development activities, we will learn if we need to modify and come up with subsequent iterations of the framework. And so I look forward to any discussions that come as a result of this, and questions and answers. So thank you for the opportunity to present.
Well, thank you, Chad, and thanks to all the presenters for your presentations. And we're looking forward now to being in the question and answer period. It seemed like several of the questions and one of my own relates to the middle tier of acquisition. So perhaps we can go ahead and start with that for the question side. So Claire and anyone else, I'm curious, I'm going to tie a couple of questions together, including one of my own. I'm curious if you think that the program is better off for having used the MTA, the middle tier of acquisition pathway. And then that kind of segues right into what Lieutenant Commander Lay has asked about whether or not, putting all these blocks together, which then exceeds the authority of a MTA, if Congress is going to be interested in that. So over to you, Claire, and then of course anyone else who has comments as well.
Okay, thanks, Jim. To answer your first question, whether I think the program's better off for having used the MTA pathway, I do think that. This program was one of the first MTA efforts, one of the Pathfinder programs. So there wasn't a whole lot of guidance at the outset. And even though I think maybe the program ended up with more technology development than what we would consider now to be like a traditional middle tier of acquisition, even though they ended up with a little more technology development, I do think that the gains made at the beginning of the program are going to benefit the program because, as I mentioned in the presentation, we're under real tight timeframes on that program, and any gains in the schedule is going to help. Obviously, the technology development and integration portion of the program is going to take how long it takes, but the gains made at the beginning of the program by using the MTA designation, I do think were beneficial, and maybe we'll save the day.
Okay.
So over to Brian's question, let's see. He says, considering the dollar limit on MTAs, he assumes we're staying under these constraints by using a block or tranche approach. So on this particular program, Brian, I think it's a great question. On this particular program, I don't think there's a concern that they are trying to get under the radar in terms of dollar limits, or that Congress is going to be concerned about designating programs MTA in the future, mainly because this program, once it's finished, and maybe even before it's finished with the rapid prototyping portion of the MTA, they're planning to transition over to the major capability acquisition pathway, which is like the old traditional MDAPs. So it'll be under the same kind of oversight constraints and financial funding that the old MDAPs and ACAT-1s were responsible for. So I think in this particular program, that's not a concern. I can't speak to the SSC programs that, or excuse me, yeah, I think you mean SSC programs that Sean spoke of, but I'm not sure that the block approach is necessarily trying to squeeze anything under the MTA thresholds. In the old days, a block approach was good because it allowed for spiral development and, kind of allowing new and innovative technologies to be uploaded as they were developed. So rather than trying to build like a huge Battlestar Galactica type satellite, you could kind of, iteratively add technologies to your program. Over.
Well, thank you very much, Claire and Brian. Hope that answers your questions. Let's go to Michael for a moment, and then we'll come back and get some of the other questions from the chat. But I wanted to just check in with you on that Agile DevSecOps operation. I'm really curious as how much day-to-day involvement is going to be required by the government in order to make that. And later on, perhaps we can tie all these things together with Agile DevSecOps and middle tier acquisition, how they all play together. But right now, how about that for a starting point?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Jim. Yeah. So, Agile is a mindset. I mean, you've probably heard this repeated over and over and over. And it's not just a mindset of the government and the contractor. The big issue here is team. It's the contractor and the government working as a team. You can't, in a lot of waterfall programs that I've been on, you can sort of, periodically check in, there's major milestones and other types of reviews and PMRs. But with Agile, to really understand what's happening, particularly when you're trying to tie it to, earned value management, you've got to be actively engaged. Every day there's a 15-minute scrum. It's a meeting of the team to talk about the challenges that they're facing and where things are going in the sprint. Really, the government needs to be in there. They need to be in the ceremonies when demonstrations are given, both at the story level and the feature level. So it does require a lot of government involvement. That's something that's
the reduction. Yeah, the reduction in number of PRs is one measure, and perhaps there are others. It was dramatic, extremely dramatic.
Yeah.
And is that really attributable to this checking in every day kind of thing? Is that how that works?
Yeah.
Or?
Yes. Because you can see the problems generating early, and you can catch it early, particularly if you tie it in with DevSecOps, where you're doing the continuous development, continuous deployment. Granted, you're not deploying to the real world, but you're deploying it to a near ops. With the government there, ensuring that the testing is thorough, and the PRs that are developed are properly categorized is essential. And so you need day-to-day hands-on. It doesn't mean 24/7, but it does mean taking a chunk of your day, a couple hours, and being engaged actively with the contractor. Over. And
I'll throw this next one out from Christina to both of our GAO folk and anyone else who'd like to chime in. Can you measure cost and schedule growth for next gen? You might need a little bit of background for folk for that, but as Christina mentioned, it seems like it's difficult to do now for MTAs and crazy for, as she says, for such a large program. Who'd like to take that one? Erin or Claire, what would you like to do?
I think first we should say that Christina is our former boss at the GAO, a former director in the contracting and national security acquisitions team. And I guess she just can't stop thinking about cost and schedule performance measures.
Nice to have a ringer on the line to help us with hard questions. So please go ahead.
Well, I guess I'll try to answer the first part of her question, whether we can measure cost and schedule growth for next gen. And I would say not yet. According to the program, there is no schedule growth, and the milestones that they've set at the outset, which is basically MTA delivery of the prototype at the end of 2023 and launch in 25, those things are still happening and still on track for that. Of course, we're all hoping that that's the case. Now, as far as the quarterly reports to Congress, what they contain is risk information and updated risk information with each new quarterly report, but the cost and schedule data, I wouldn't say that it's necessarily up to date or being tracked in the congressional reports. It's more what the risks are and what the likelihood that those risks are going to happen, and then what the consequences of those risks would be should they happen. So I'm gonna punt that one a little bit until we get a little bit more data as we continue to look at the program. But at this point, there is no schedule growth because the program's on track.
Let's take the next, Christine. I'm sorry, go ahead, Erin. The next one for you as well.
Sure. I was just going to jump in and I say that the OPIR program established some guardrails as part of the MTA pathway at the beginning. And so they can track whether or not they've exceeded their guardrails, but it's not the same as a traditional cost estimate. So Christina had a question about whether or not we can see any progress with DoD's ability to synchronize ground, space, and user systems with the creation of the Space Force. This is a little bit of a cop-out. It's a bit too early to tell because the Space Force is just really getting on its legs now. However, a thought kind of occurred to me. So one of the challenges that Claire's report mentioned was that the government is acting as the lead integrator for the first time. And I'm thinking, that might be an opportunity for DoD to improve its synchronization of the satellite ground and terminals as it acts as a lead system integrator for the first time, and really kind of gets some experience with that. I think it had only done it once before with GPS. And then I think OPIR is its second time acting as a lead systems integrator rather than the main contractor doing so. So I think that might be something to keep an eye on.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, Chad, I think it's time for us to come back to you if you don't mind. I'm just curious, you covered the program management and engineering, and I saw the question from Sean in the chat as well. You covered those occupational competencies. What about the other acquisition functional areas, financial management, contracting, logistics, test and evaluation? Can you help us with that?
Sure. So the challenge is that according to our numbers, when we look at it, about 51% of our workforce won't be represented by occupational competencies if we only do PM and engineering. And so we made that aware. We made the AETC and Space Force S1, our personnel folks, made them aware of that. And the decision was made to proceed with just the active duty engineers and PMs, and we would look at the other acquisition functional areas sometime down the road. And so when we first roll out, the plan is to, again, code every single position in the Space Force with the requisite competency proficiencies. There's going to be about 51% of our workforce for which their positions, and they're overwhelmingly civilian, or they're going to be airmen performing FM and contracting activities. Their positions won't be coded because we don't have those occupational competencies yet. And so I think the coding of those positions is going to be a forcing function to get us to actually move out and get the rest of the acquisition workforce. And Jim, I got a question here from Jason that highlights a point that actually carries over. Jason had asked about, every Marine is a rifleman, in the Army, everybody is a soldier. In the Navy, even, I have a colleague who was a judge advocate, and he had spent 6 months at sea being a judge advocate. So you're going to go out there. Part of our heritage in the Space Force that comes from the Air Force, and I'm a retired active duty Air Force, part of our heritage is that you can't put me in an F-16 and have me execute the pointy end of the Air Force's mission. You can't take an active duty program manager in the Space Force and sit them down and have them fly a satellite. It's that we are an interesting and unique force. So those fundamental skill sets that allow every Marine to say every Marine's a rifleman, I suggest the Air Force and the Space Force have some unique challenges with regards to that. And the occupational competencies and the foundational competencies, we're trying to implement them in a way that every Guardian is a Guardian, and try and make that happen.
Interesting. And perhaps we can cycle back later after we go to Mac's question for Mike. But cycle back later, perhaps if we have time for just even a moment, is that there are no civilians in the Space Force. I'd heard somebody say something about it was going to be half active duty, half civilian, but we'll come back to that. Mike, over to you for Mac's question and comment there. And let's see if I can, yeah, there we go.
Yeah. So I'll try and answer that quickly because we're running out of time. But I think there's a couple of things we can look at. When I was thinking about the requirements challenge, the rigidity, one possibility that we've been kicking around, not just at the Space Force, but been talking to OSD is structuring those requirements such that there's buckets. Must have requirements as soon as possible, must have requirements, but you have a little bit of time to do it, and then need to have requirements, but could be slipped into sustainment, for example, and then use incentives to try to pull those, need to have into the current development environment and not pass it into sustainment. That's one approach. Another approach, which I know a lot of contractors don't want to talk about, and that's the modular contracting approach, which again, shorter contracts, so you get deliverables on a much, with deadlines that are limited by the funding available. that's another approach that could address the need for a rapid turnaround and trying to keep things on schedule. So those are two areas. There's many others.
Well,
that,
keeping things on
brought
schedule
up.
is a perfect segue. We are in our last 10 seconds, and so I'm going to wrap it up. I've learned something today, and I hope you all did too. Really thank you all for your attendance and participation. Please check the symposium program for a link to the next scheduled event. And with that, we're out of time. So thank you very much. Thanks to all the panelists.
Thanks,
I
Jim.
enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thanks all.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody.